Hello everyone, it's good to be joining you at the Digital Innovation and Women's Empowerment in the 21st Century virtual symposium as part of the Pontoon project on digital upskilling and economic inclusion for women. I'm Gillian Youngs and I have been asked to share my own story with you, my feminist story, and that's quite unusual for me because I'm usually presenting on my research and applied projects, but hopefully I can share with you here some of my experience which may be of interest and what I've learned from it. I start with this first slide, which is very much about my learning from my life as a whole, the different kinds of professional engagements I've had and the relationships I've had, professional and otherwise, and my membership of the startup community, which has taught me a great deal. Basically, these 10 digital rules to live by, as I've called them here, are about you, they're about your networks, and they're about how you approach yourself as an innovator. In terms of you, it's important that you focus on your own path and the specificities of that path and how you want to follow it. It's not just about what you want to do, but it's also about how you want to do it. If you want to build a business, there are all sorts of ways that you can do that. And this should be something that very much is chosen by you and your preferences and what's important to you. And also the timescales over which you wish to build things. Some people wish to do things as quickly as possible, and others like to take their time. They all have their valuable elements, and it's up to you to make the right choices for you, and to never forget that you're the one shaping this path, and you're the one who has primarily to validate it. But of course, the second area of your networks and your communities is a big part of how you get things right, and how when you get stuck, you find ways to move ahead. So I mentioned things here to deal with how you think about those networks and how you realize that you can actually always find other people to help you find out things that you need to know and to navigate what's ahead when you're not quite sure how to do that. I mentioned the issue of baby steps leading to giant strides, and that's a big part of that picture. Sometimes we get stuck and we have to stop and think again, and often we need a bit more help than just our own heads to do that. So contacting others in our network and sharing with them can be a big part of what we should be doing. Celebration, I always like to emphasize, is key to success. Celebrate what you do right, but also celebrate your failures, because if you can learn a lot from those failures, that will take you ahead in new ways. And you often hear entrepreneurs say that they've learned more from their failures than they have from their successes. I would say from my experience, it's been pretty much equal, but you do learn lessons very deeply when you fail, and sometimes that can be tough. I mentioned at the end here the importance of being authentic, making and sharing your story as part of your brand. You are your brand, and you may be developing a brand, but that's very much an articulation of you and your ambitions as well. So lots of focus on that, I think, is a really creative area. A little bit about myself and my path, which has taken me through a number of professional areas, namely journalism and the media, my own independent communications consultancy, and academia. I worked in several specialist areas, several sectors, particularly the civil aviation area, which I specialised in as a journalist in my later years in that professional arena, and then went on to focus on in my independent communications consultancy. I worked for clients like BAA PLC, and for Reader Fusion Simulation, who worked in aircraft simulation, and projects around translating expert material for general audiences, and also on internal communication projects, as well as other media areas. I've moved through technologies myself, from the old-fashioned typewriter in journalism when we worked with carbon paper and bits of pieces of paper all over the newsroom, right through to the contemporary times when, of course, we barely use paper at all. I learned to touch type, which I didn't need to do as a journalist, but I decided I would do. And it's come in very useful, of course, in the PC age when so much is done through computer. I launched my business when the personal computer was really coming to the fore. And that was part of my decision also to move on in education. Initially, I wanted to go straight into journalism from school. I could have gone to university, but I decided instead to do a new pre-entry 1-year course at technical college and then take an apprenticeship. And that was exactly the right route for me. And I enjoyed my journalistic time extremely and was very happy in journalism, but realized at some point that I wanted to return to education and go to university. And that was when I decided to launch my business. And I developed my business alongside my undergraduate degree and worked on the business in the holidays and developed through academia and finally ended up as a full-time academic. I often call myself an accidental academic, but what I mean by that in a way is there are other paths I could have taken, but this was the one I focused on eventually. Of course, through then, now we're in the World Wide Web age where really it's all about networking online, whether we're talking about information or communities, and I'll say more about that in a moment. But it didn't take the digital age for communities to be important to me. They've actually been central to the whole of my career. And one of the reasons I chose academia was because it was focused on global communities, and that suited me very much. And I wanted to work in an environment where I could develop communities and collaborate with people and work on projects. And I've done that a lot in the academic world. And I've built communities in my feminist activism and networking throughout my career as well. And I've also built communities, obviously, in my more recent work in the startup area, where collaboration and networking are core to the actual mode of operation. So community has been right there up front all the time, and it's brought me a lot of happiness and satisfaction, as well as a lot of learning. I've mentioned networking, and that's at the heart of being successful and empowering oneself in the digital age. I think you have to realize that so much is achieved through networks, not just of people, but networks of information and sharing as well. But it does require that we have a particularly open approach, that we learn to be determined and not too rigid, that we stay open to new ideas and possibilities, and that we develop and learn from collaborations and seek inspiration in ourselves as well as others. It also is important in a network world to honor your own expertise and experience, because in order to be able to share it effectively and in order to be able to put it to good use, you need to understand yourself exactly what it is. And although that sounds straightforward, sometimes a lot of us recognize that we find it hard to do that. Becoming articulate and precise about what you bring to the table is important in a network world which is incredibly complex, and where you may have people with wide-ranging skill sets coming together to do and achieve certain forms of work or project, or ideation, even thinking through ideas and particularly problem solving. Lifelong learning in the information age is a very specific thing, and it's something that excites me a lot. It's really all about empowerment through accessible knowledge and people. We've moved from books to web pages, social networking, and networked innovation. And it's a big change. I love books. I'm passionate about books. I don't think that will ever change for me. And I know a lot of people feel exactly the same. But of course, I spend most of my time now on the web and working in networks and looking at information online. And it reminds me constantly how much the world has changed from my days when I used to go along to the local library, and that was the high point of the week, to collect my new set of books and to embark on a whole new range of knowledge gathering. The change is a lot about the horizontal nature of the digital world, and I want to stress here how much that is about people and information, those two things. If we look at information, in the world I grew up in, it was very difficult to have access to primary sources of information. I grew up in a world, as many of us did, of secondary sources being the ones that we could access. And we had to do a lot of work often in order to access primary sources. And often that was really impossible to do or extremely difficult to do. How the world has changed now with the web and our capacity and ability to find primary sources, not only very easily, but also instantaneously, and to download those sources and have them as reference to shape our own thinking and our own learning and what we're doing. So for me, that is a real revolution, as is the whole horizontal nature of networking among people, because I grew up in a world of vertical networks where you always thought in terms of hierarchy, and you had to go through a number of levels to contact the person at the top. Whereas now we do live in a much more horizontal environment where it's much easier to find people who are expert or who are controlling certain processes and to have contact through them. And of course, we can do that through social media and networking, which people do a lot, but we can also do it directly as well. So this is an empowering area of change, as is the access to primary sources. And I think those two combined, for me, are absolutely fundamental to digital information. And without all the changes we have had associated with digital technologies and particularly the World Wide Web, we would have a very different world that would be much more like the one I grew up in. And boy, how has that world transformed in these ways now. I wanted to highlight these 21st century skills that are identified by the World Economic Forum, a combination of foundational literacies, competencies, and character qualities. And what is interesting about these is it shows that lifelong learning is as much about formal learning and the kind of education that we have and the skills that we develop out of that and in the workplace, but also about the character qualities we have. And if you look at this third sector, curiosity, initiative, persistence, grit, adaptability, leadership, social and cultural awareness, it's clear that those are things that we develop through all areas of our life, not just work. And they're competencies that really allow us as people to develop and grow and to be useful and to be productive. And they don't actually necessarily rely on formal educational backgrounds. They often have a lot to do with life experiences and the relationships we've had and the things we've done perhaps in other areas of our lives, such as sport and other hobbies, or in community work and voluntary work, or even our own personal journey. And I see those areas as a driving edge, particularly in entrepreneurial communities. A little bit about my own analog and digital history as a journalist, an entrepreneur, an academic, an author, an activist, an innovator. It's involved a lot of different forms of activity, which I've enjoyed and met challenges in all the way through, I would say. As I say, I still remain a book person, but I'm also focused on networks and always have been, and I'm now moving into a new professional stage of my life where I'm having to develop and wanting to develop new networks. But this has its challenges, and I'm finding those healthy, but sometimes it's a bit scary, sometimes it's a bit overwhelming, often it's exciting and enjoyable, but there's lots of steps along the way, and I have to be determined to just keep on taking those steps to get somewhere new. I've published books in my academic career, and that's been important to me, and I co-edited one of the first critical collections on globalization, which went into 3 editions, which is quite unusual. And that pleases me because it means it's been used a lot by students across the world and researchers to help them in their work. That's the first area of specialization of mine. The second area, which led on from globalization really, was digital economy. And also throughout all my work, I have focused on feminist theory and practice and community building. And one of the outcomes of that I'm most pleased about is the International Feminist Journal of Politics. I co-founded that journal with colleagues from Australia and from the USA in 1999. And it's had several editing teams since then and is now firmly and successfully established as a journal and continues to grow. I always remind myself that without the digital age, that would have been a huge challenge and possibly impossible at that time to do, because the collaboration that actually founded it relied completely on digital communication and networking. And it happened across the world, and it's meant that from the start it was a global venture, and that's enabled it to grow globally and involve more and more areas of the world and more feminist communities and communities of people interested in researching on women across the globe. Of course, we're in a new normal now in the times of the pandemic, and that's presenting all sorts of challenges on global, national, local and individual levels. There are lots of new needs and possibilities for innovation and new ways to drive solutions. I would see this as a pivotal time for digital innovation and women's empowerment in that context, because clearly women have a lot of new things to bring to the table in terms of identifying what the problems are and looking for solutions and coming up with imaginative ways of addressing those solutions, addressing those issues, which are fit for the people who need them to be addressed and are also efficient and effective in different ways. So this is a good time for the Pontoon Symposium to be happening, and it's a good time to be thinking about these things on behalf of society and to think of how we can mobilize more and more women to be involved in innovation of all kinds. My work these days focuses a lot on design thinking and design approaches, and one of the reasons that interests me is because these pay attention to values and process very much in ways that are aligned with feminist thinking. But it's a very practical approach to the way that we might develop a product or a service, or also a business or a new organization, because it looks at the different steps and areas of that venture, whatever that might be, and the kinds of values that are relevant to it. And it enables us to attach values to process. So it keeps values front and center when we're thinking about the how. It makes sure that the what and the how and the why are closely aligned and that we have strategies for doing that. So it is important to think outside the box and be creative and practical and make sure that you're designing your own path. And of course, a lot of us are aiming to make a difference of some kind, whether it's in our own lives, our families' lives, or the community we live in, and other communities near and far. I've listed some useful resources and networks here, which I hope will be of some assistance. In a sense, it's sort of showing what's out there. There's a lot out there that's helpful, and one could put hundreds of links here, but I've just put a few that may be of interest to people. And my last thoughts as I sign off are really just to look forward to an expanded era of digital innovation and women's empowerment, and to hope that some of what I've said is relevant to your own journeys.